Hello.
Hey, hey,
How's it going?
going good.
Good, good, good. Yeah, I was trying to remember what your background looked like. I was like, I know there's like a river and a castle. I did like a kind of a.
Yeah, it's
I,
pretty close, man.
well, like the way I was picturing it was like a green countryside with a river and a castle. But now that I look at it, there's not really that much green. But
No, it's a lot more blue, but I guess that's just, same area, different weather.
yeah, yeah. You know what? I always looked at it and thought like this is like England or Scotland or something. It looks like that kind of landscape, and then I guess I associated that in my mind with like green hills or something. I don't know. Uh, how are you doing today? Oh, I already asked you that. Are you ready to
Oh,
go on
good.
the?
Yeah, I'm doing good.
Good.
How are you doing, Cricket? How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm you know, I'm just still dabbling in the art thing all the time, but that is not what we're doing today. Today we are doing a 538 podcast where they're talking about kind of polling numbers going into the November election season. Or no, you got anything you want to add about that?
No, I'm really looking forward. I think 538 is like the gold standard when it comes to this kind of polling. And I think they do a really good job of making the case for polls, which I think are unfairly maligned, or at least maligned too much. Certainly they
Mm-hmm.
have their flaws, and you know, there was definitely a big polling error in 2020. Not really so much in 2016. It was mostly the projections based off of polls, where people really went wild with it. Um, but I really think it. It's just this thing where if the poll disagrees with you, you're going to be like, "Oh, come on! We all know polling is bullshit." It was wrong in 2016. 99% chance Hillary Clinton wins. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So I really love digging into this stuff.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Like you said, I think in 2016 it was mostly like irresponsible journalism uh, that was the source of that. I think was it New York Times that was saying 99% for
I
Clinton,
think
or
that
is
was
it
the Washington Post
Washington
takes that
Post?
honor. But yeah, no, I love 538 and I really like bowling, so I look forward to this. Although I don't know, cricket, top crops to grow at home to save you from starving.
Oh, I
I don't
don't want to
know.
starve.
Yeah, Jesus. Oh my God. Next thing you're gonna tell me some investment guru says that, this will happen in the next 3 months. I've got to click to watch, figure out, protect my investment.
Hello and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk,
I'm Nate Silver,
and
and
this
this
is Model
is
Talk.
Model Talk.
Is it
Uh, Nate,
is
as
it
the
possible for you
listeners
to
can
turn it up
probably
slightly,
hear,
or
we
no? I have it at 200%. It's still a little bit quiet.
Let me see here.
are
Oh,
That's
okay.
louder. Okay,
That's
hold on.
somewhere in between. It would be good.
unfortunately remote
Perfect. Thank
again.
you.
We would have liked to be in studio, but your schedule is a little crazy. At the very least, we are recording a Model Talk. It's been a minute. Where have you been? What have you been up to?
Uh, I went to Montreal for a Labor Day weekend. Uh, Canada's nice, man. How's Canada not up like every other country in the world?
I don't know. Canadian listeners, please call in and answer Nate's open question. I mean, I'm sure there are problems with Canada. I don't know.
I mean, you had like Rob Ford. They haven't won the Stanley Cup in a long time, right? They've got some issues, but overall, man. And the worst thing about it is they're really humble about it, which is like more annoying. Like Canada, you should brag more about how you're like one of the most competently run companies. You're multilingual. You're
Companies.
multi-ethnic countries. Yeah. You have
Evidence of
successful
dementia right there.
businesses. Your wealth. I mean, what Canada? Even though it's
Myopic's gonna be
cold,
mauling
maybe
if
it's
he
because
ever
it's
sees
cold,
this.
right? In the U.S., we can like go to the beach, and in Canada, they have to be like all I don't know. It's terrible all winters. They have to be very industrious, I guess.
Nate, it
That
sounds
seems
like
like
you want to
yeah.
move to Canada.
No, I wouldn't. Yeah.
Wait, so why, after all that, would you not move to Canada?
I like the U.S. and our dynamic risk-taking system.
Okay. So then you don't actually think Canada has all that much to brag about?
No, it does. I'm right.
We should talk about the model. And we have a familiar caveat to start off this recording. It is Tuesday, September 13th. So when, dear listener, you are listening to this data may be a couple days old, but here's what the forecast shows today. Republicans have a 73% chance of winning control of the House, according to the deluxe version of the model, and Democrats have a 69% chance of winning the Senate. The governor's
already out of date, Galen.
It's already out of date. Did you just update it between the 5 minutes that I was looking at this and started recording?
I don't personally update the model. FiveE does. But according to FiveE, Democrats now have a 71% chance of winning.
FiveE's their mascot.
The Senate and 27 in the House.
So wait, so this is just about as close to parity for Republicans and Democrats between the House and Senate that we have ever gotten.
It's interesting, yeah. FiveE is excited about that.
Thank you for updating me with those correct numbers, Nate. If, of course, you are listening to this on Thursday or later, those numbers might have changed, so you can go check them out on the 538 website. When it comes to the governor's races, not all that much has changed. They haven't changed nearly as much as the Senate race, for example, or the Senate forecast. But here are some of the key races. Arizona and Kansas are toss-ups. Wisconsin, Oregon, and Nevada lean Democratic. Michigan and Pennsylvania are likely Democratic. And Georgia, Florida, and Alaska are likely Republican. Nate, I should also mention that there are primaries tonight in Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Delaware. And when I say tonight, I do mean Tuesday, September 13th. So by the time folks are listening to this, they will know the result of probably the most interesting race in this primary set, which is the Republican Senate primary in New Hampshire. If there was a significant or surprising result, we will talk about it on Monday. Fear not, but we unfortunately do not know the results of those primary races yet. We're going to record this podcast nonetheless. Are you ready, Nate?
I'm prepared.
We haven't done this in a while.
Can we pause for a second?
Maybe a month even.
Just because they mentioned the primary results, I figured I'd read these off. Like for the Rhode Island Democratic gubernatorial primary, it's Daniel McKee. Wait, you know what? I opened a page that I thought had all the results, and it actually only had one of them.
Disaster.
Okay, well, never mind. Let's just I'll watch the thing.
We laid out the numbers. How would you describe the state of the race beyond just, 70? Republicans have a 73% chance of winning the House, and Democrats have a 71% chance of winning the Senate.
Well, I kind of think we can reduce everything down to that one number, so we can just end the podcast now.
But, we've, in past elections, taken great pains to explain probability, put it in context, talk about uncertainty. It's post-Labor Day now. We're less than 2 months away from the election. How should people be thinking about those numbers in reality?
I mean, 71 is a pretty nice number. It's higher than 70. It's lower than 72. Okay, I'm being goofy.
Nate, are you high right now?
I'm not. No, I mean, look, they're both... If you've dealt with 538, it always seems like things are in the 70-30 range, right?
Yes.
That page did have all of them. I just didn't open the right tab.
Okay, now maybe we really should just close up shop.
No, what are you asking? 30% happens all the time. Aaron Judge is like a 303 batting average, right? That's Republican chances of winning the Senate are still an Aaron Judge base hit, right? Or Democrats holding the House is in that vicinity too, right? In a poker hand, if you have a flush draw against a made hand, it makes it about 30% of the time, a little more actually, but in that general ballpark. So these are like very, very ordinary course of events if you were to have Republicans win the Senate or Democrats keep the House. Those are both very, very, very plausible outcomes. With that said, clearly you've seen movement toward the Democrats that's been quite steady, really, right? I mean, if you look at our forecast, like almost every day the number has either held steady or gone up for Democrats in the Senate. So I kind of keep waiting for like an opportunity to say, okay, now there's been a little bit of a tick back to Republicans. Let's talk about why the fundamentals are still favorable for the GOP. And in some ways they are. I mean, we have the whole history of midterm elections being very bad for the president's party typically. Biden's approval rating is improved, but still fairly poor. But you've had this steady increase, I think maybe in part because, like, the model was a little skeptical of this kind of summer polling surge and election surge too, for given the special election results for Democrats. The longer it holds, the more willing it is to buy that maybe we will defy history, and this will be the rare year where you have a relatively neutral year in a midterm year.
So actually, you mentioning that sort of near linear improvement for Democrats brings up a listener question that we got. Dylan asks, should it be surprising that the House and Senate forecasts have shown near linear improvement for Democrats throughout August? Is this because the model is slow to pick up on sharp improvements, or has the environment really been steadily improving for Democrats week to week?
No, I think it's more the former. I don't know what slow or fast means, right? In general, polling is pretty steady in midterm elections until the summer. This summer you had major events happening, particularly the Dobbs decision that, if you don't know by now, overturned Roe v. Wade. And so, yeah, it's kind of slowly scaling back its skepticism is one way to put it, right? But it's designed to be conservative about moving, at least at this point in the cycle, right? It'll get more aggressive by the time we get to the last couple of weeks. But a lot of the movement in polls can be just noise. It doesn't know, though, that there's a credible cause behind it, right? If you knew that event X occurred on this date, we actually do this for some of our presidential forecasts now, right? We, after debates and conventions, kind of reset the calendar, so the model will move more aggressively after kind of these known events. We don't do that for one-off news developments like Roe being overturned. But in principle, that would be the right way to critique the model, right? You would say, this is a major event. You shouldn't have to wait for 2 months before you price this in, right? The first 5 or 6 polls should have told you that already. We're also, by the way, not accounting for special election results, right? There are different things going on. Also in the deluxe forecast, we use expert ratings. I think those can be a little bit lagging, frankly, sometimes. I think the experts weren't expecting this shift back, right? But yeah, basically the model's been conservative. We can debate whether that's a good choice or not. But that's, it's not like things are getting better and better for Democrats, I don't think, as much as the model has been skeptical, and now there's finally enough data to say, yeah, this looks a little bit unusual this year.
Nate,
I think in particular, something that is a really big asset to Democrats is it feels like, and this is it's really hard to conduct a specific analysis on what the feeling of the nation is. But it feels like for the past 3-4 months, we've started to be on more of an upward trend. I think a lot of that is the inflation has really started to die down. There was a lot of sort of uncertainty about what exactly our economic forecast was going to look like, for this year, and including sort of the back half of last year. And you're starting to see real improvements on that. In particular, a lot of the pent-up demand from sort of everyone having been locked down in COVID across the world, along with a couple other things. Those the effects that those are sort of the course that those were taking on the global supply chains are starting to run out. So you're starting to see that stuff pick up again, which was a huge source of sort of the economic trouble. I also think there's just been a really steady supply of sort of moderate wins for Democrats that are really starting to stack up in terms of just the feeling of the nation. I think, the Ukraine-Russia stuff, as much as I wish this wasn't a left-right issue in this country, but it is. And the fact that Ukraine is just kicking ass and just recently we've had this huge offensive in the north. That definitely goes to Democrats' support. Obviously, the Roe v. Wade stuff is a huge energizer for their base as well. You throw that on top of the economic stuff, the fact that, depending upon where you're at in the country, COVID stuff is basically gone, right? At least, where I'm at. I'm by no means in a red area. I'm in a pretty blue area. And I hardly see anyone wearing masks anymore and stuff like that. Not to say that that's necessarily a good thing, but I think it helps Democrats because makes it feels like, oh, the country's getting back to normal. We fixed the problem, and Democrats as the incumbents, get to own that win in the same way that if the economy was doing in a bad spot, they would own that loss. So I think there's been a real sort of building of momentum over the summer, really. That's really starting to manifest itself in how people feel about the country, and you're starting to see that with Biden's approval ratings going up for the first time since I think Afghanistan when they sort of fell off the cliff.
Yeah, I was going to mention the COVID thing as well because I think it's a little bit easy to overlook it because it's not front and center. It's not like at the front of our minds, but just the absence of it I think has a lot of explanatory power for it, just in terms of like where we are now compared to where we were a year or so ago, and also it probably has a lot to do with the inflation problems and supply chain. Well, definitely the supply chain thing. Economics is hard. I don't know how much it has to do with the inflation, but it plausibly might. And yeah, like you said, they've got several kind of policy wins for the Biden administration. The Ukraine thing going well. All of that is good observations. The Roe v. Wade thing has kind of surprised me. Yeah, because when it originally happened, yeah, you and I talked about it. I think this might have even been the first episode we ever did, where I really didn't expect that to play out to as much to Democrats' favor as it seems like it has. And maybe I'm calling that a little bit prematurely because the elections haven't actually happened yet.
Yeah, it ain't over till the bell ring.
Yeah. But my initial expectation would be that it would probably have little to no effect in blue states because no policy is actually going to change there, and that in red states it would just like energize everybody. Because like overturning Roe versus Wade isn't actually the end of the fight for pro-life people. They still have to decide which pro-life policy to have. So I didn't particularly think it was going to energize Democrats more than Republicans, but the early evidence indicates that it probably has.
Mm.
To my
Yeah, I
surprise.
think there's another sort of big part of it, which is that when you get a big political victory like this, sometimes you can sort of reach a bit too far, and there's a lot of blowback. Same thing. The Democrats passed Obamacare or the assault weapons ban would be another great example. They got killed in the next midterms because not just because it really energizes the other base, but also because the more moderate members of your party might switch over, might decide, what, I don't know, if I'm a blue dog Democrat, I see, all this stuff about socialized, medicine coming from Obama, maybe I don't vote, maybe I actually vote for more moderate Republican. It's the same thing on the reverse. I think there's a big wealth of people, particularly like suburban Republican voters, that they definitely want some abortion restrictions, but maybe not as crazy as some of these states that were coming. And you were seeing stories, I think it was like Indiana or something, or Ohio, where some like underage girl had to travel states. Just a horrible look optically. That's the kind of thing that can really eat away at the margins of like the more moderate voters, which depending upon where these Senate or House races are, could be could be massive, right? That's the other thing you have to consider is that one of the reasons why Democrats are looking a lot more favored in the Senate right now is just because of the particular Senate races. There's not that many Senate seats that are actually up for re-election, and of those that are, it just statistically happens to be that there's some big advantage for Democrats in a lot of these.
It's the ones that they're like relitigating the 2016 races because it's 6 years later. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're dealing with a smaller sample size, particular niches of voters can be way more impactful than they ought be on the national stage. So if you're losing out on, the moderate Republican, soccer moms that are like, not too hot about a 15-week national abortion ban that Lindsey Graham's putting up for a vote right now, then that could be a big source for aid for the Democrats.
I think that the point that you made about blowback is pretty interesting because, like, at face value, I want to agree with that, but then also I'm not sure how to square that with the other thing we were talking about a few minutes ago, where it seems like getting policy wins seems to actually help a party, but then on the other hand, it's like if they get I mean, maybe it's just if they are perceived to be winning too much, then it hurts
Yeah,
them.
it's I we had this thing in the type of debate I did called the politics DA, which was this whole argument that said that, said we're not going to talk about the actual effects of your plan. We're going to talk about the effects of trying to legislatively pass your plan. If you pass this, the current sitting president will lose political capital, and he needs that to pass this other thing. So we agree. Your plan to, do fishing reefs, do offshore fish like farms is a good idea. But if you do that, it's 2013. Obama's going to lose all the political capital to pass these fish farms because they're unpopular, which means he won't be able to get, climate change or some other bill. So, and really getting into those intricate arguments, there's all these ideas about political capital and how it gets expended, the idea of winners win, the idea that, just getting a big win. It's a really complicated thing that depends heavily, I think, on the spin. The way that a plan can come off can be a big win. I think, like, for example, like the Inflation Reduction Act would be an example of, like, yeah, getting that through. That is just a huge, massive win, but it did still cost a bunch of political capital. That's like the one reconciliation bill for the year. Or I guess 3 out of 3 of the reconciliation bills of the year because of how the system works, which is really dumb. But yeah, so when it comes to this abortion stuff, I think the question is this a win that's going to motivate people that already weren't motivated? Or is it more likely to motivate people who were not motivated? And where do those groups lie? And it just feels like, particularly with some of the more far-reaching state-level abortion stuff, which I think is where Republicans are really getting killed. The court case is not nearly as unpopular as the implication of all these Republican state laws that are generating these awful-looking headlines. That just is so much more likely to make someone who's anti-abortion really freak out than someone who's pro-abortion freak out, even if they're freaking out like in joy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I mean, just generally, outrage is more motivating to people than than joy.
Yeah.
But let's see. You were talking about the thing about kind of managing perceptions. That if you're seen to be winning too much, it could be bad. But if you're seen to be winning a little bit, it could be good. And it made me think of the way that Trump talks, because like. On the one hand, when he's talking about his own whatever he's up to, he's constantly saying like, "Oh, we're winning bigly." Like when nobody's ever won so much, you're gonna be so tired of winning, right? And it makes me wonder like if that could work against him. But on the other hand, he kind of like turns around and plays the victim sometimes too. So that they're all out to get me, and it's a witch hunt. So I don't know.
Yeah. It's really funny. It reminds me of, I hate to say this, but a really interesting point made by Jordan Peterson about the election was he talked about how it was a mistake for Trump to sort of make the claims about the election being stolen because he's supposed to be a winner and winners don't let losers cheat them. And it was such an interesting way to look at it from sort of that view of like, winners win, even and just the aesthetic of being a winner. Even though, I mean, obviously, Trump is not a winner or very rich, but that like aesthetic is so important in terms of sort of cultivating a kind of like culture and sufficient motivation.
Well, it's what he uses to sell himself,
Yeah, and more than that, in the election, particularly in 2016, it cultivated this certain kind of, I don't know if I would say tone or an atmosphere. It generated a certain atmosphere in the Trump movement of like, we're gonna do it. We don't care. We're on the, there are no brakes on the Trump train. Sort of this sort of very cavalier, gallant attitude of like, just like, yeah, we're gonna go and we're gonna change everything. That let them really just deflect off a bunch of the like real criticisms. Like, talking about how, it's really unlikely for Trump to win. Yeah, whatever, man. We're gonna do it. We're gonna change. That kind of cultivating that kind of atmosphere is really good, not just to fend off certain attacks, but to keep your own people internally motivated, right? It can be a real killer politically if your movement is like defined by like this idea that like it's doomed, we're fucked, right? Even if it's more realistic, right? It's why no president ever wants to say, you know what, I don't. No president is ever going to say, I don't know if we're going to win this, guys. Because that can have an effect on the people who are going to listen to you most are your supporters, and that can have an effect on them to not vote, to not be as motivated to go out and do things, and it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So there's this huge culture in trying to sort of set the tone as to what a thing is, as opposed to what it actually is, what the tone of it ought be. Because that is like an actual, like, that is a huge variable in terms of determining the outcome.
Yeah. So it's like if people feel like they're gonna lose, that's demotivating. But also, if they feel like victory is too certain, that's demotivating
Yeah.
too. So it's like
You gotta ride it.
they've got to strike this balance where it's like, oh, it looks like we're winning, but we're not there yet. You know, and apparently that's the balance you have to strike. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and arguably you can kind of see this in the mail-in stuff, which I was like, they're going to rig the mail-in stuff. Man, how many Republicans were going to vote by mail-in, then didn't vote by mail-in, and just ended up not voting at all? And could that have changed the result of the election? I mean, there's a non-zero chance that could have happened, especially if you're throwing all the Republicans that died from COVID probably in, like, states he lost. Like, there's a real chance that if Trump hadn't fucked up so much on COVID and he hadn't talked mail-in voting, he could have won. So, it is so hard to thread that needle of keeping your people motivated but positive, but not too positive. You know, it's so tough.
And Trump just has the tendency to like go to extremes. He's like either we're winning bigly and we're the biggest winners ever, or else it's terrible, it's a disaster.
Yeah, it's like it sort of will weave together the two statements. The corrupt deep state are unlimited in their power, and they are going to do everything they can. They control everything absolutely to stop us from winning. But we're going to win.
I tend to
wait, what?
I tend to think it's kind of like a function of his personality, just because he's such a big like he wants to be the center of attention all the time, and it's kind of like I don't know, like you just say all these like superlatives all the time, just to try to sound interesting or something. I don't know exactly how to describe that, but I think
he's talking like Vosh. What the hell, Trump?
Well, a little bit like Vosh.
I'm admittedly beset by fraud of the deep state.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I've ever heard Trump compared to Vosh before, but that's an interesting comparison. I don't know. Like,
yeah. I don't know. I think the criticisms of Vosh go a little too far in terms of him being overly wordy. But he is a little overly wordy, but so am I. So I feel the need to defend it.
Yeah, I mean, we all are. If we're streamers, then we all like to hear ourselves talk. But,
yeah.
I mean, don't worry about it. Like I like to have you on my show because you like to talk. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and arguably a huge part of Trump's success is the way he talks too. I mean, that's one of the things where when people say I like Trump because he speaks his mind, even though this dude's a total fucking two-faced liar. And part of the reason is because he just kind of comes off as just one of the boys,
Well, he's like uninhibited, right? He's people will say he's honest, but like there's like a certain like a little grain of truth to that. He's honest the same way that like a drunk person is honest or something. It's just like they're just not inhibited by the same things that would get other people to lie.
Yep.
It still doesn't stop him from lying every third sentence, but
You are hitting on all kinds of questions that we got from our listeners, so I'm just going to keep on going. I do have some questions of my own I want to get to, but our next listener question asks, I'm under the impression the model doesn't use special election results in making its calculations. If that's the case, could Nate wildly speculate about how including results from this year might affect the current probabilities for the House and Senate?
Okay. So we did look at this when we designed the model, I guess, 4 years ago. And found that using special election results didn't really improve things and added like a lot of complication. In part because you are supposed to have like lots of other polling data. I mean, like the way I think about special elections is that they like provide some cap, maybe above and beyond what the model says on Democrats' like downside, right? Clearly, you're going to have a lot of Democratic enthusiasm this year. You may also have Republican enthusiasm more so than you saw in the specials, but like that caps some of the scenarios, like in 2014 or 2010, where Democrats just didn't show up at the polls at all, right? So that hedges their downside a little bit. It probably ought to make you a little bit less worried, although still somewhat worried, about the polling being off in a Democratic direction again, as it was in 2020 and 2016. In these races where you've had polls, Democrats have matched or beat the polls in these special elections, as well as the Kansas abortion referendum, sometimes by a pretty big margin. And so that seems like it's important confirmatory evidence. But no, the model does not use that data directly.
On the same theme of special elections, our next question from Matt, in a casual tone, asks, Yo Galen, I got beef with the model. Dems just won in Alaska special, but the model hasn't adjusted odds of Dems winning Alaska at large in general at all. What gives, bro? Should we expect that special election outcomes will change the forecast for those elections in November?
I mean, that's the kind of thing that should show up in the expert ratings in the Alaska seat, right? So has there been no change at all? Is that true? Let me look at
this question may have been sent in a couple weeks ago, but I don't think there's been much change at all, if there has been any.
It's true that so there is a change here where Democrats went from like 14 to 21% in Alaska, and I assume that reflects the fact that some expert raters updated their Alaska rankings after the special election. So yeah, no, look, there probably is a case that if you actually had a special election in this one district or state, then that provides some extra information. We already use like 15 different types of data in this election forecast. So some of it's just a matter of like, you have to draw some boundaries. But yeah, in principle, then I think our model is probably underrating Democrats in Alaska. At least the classic version where we aren't accounting for those expert ratings.
We have done deep dives on this in the past, but I think we still have yet to do one in the 2022 cycle. And so you mentioned we have 15 different types of data in the model. For maybe new listeners or to refresh our memories, what are the key components that go into the forecast?
Well, polls. So obviously if you have local polls of a race, that's very nice. Otherwise, the generic ballot. The next most important rating is probably historical, what we call the partisan lean index. So that is historically based on recent presidential and state legislative election results, how a district lines up relative to the country as a whole. Is it Republican leaning or Democratic leaning? Those tend to be fairly stable. There's various indicators pertinent to the candidates, how much money they've raised, how much electoral experience they have. If they are a current member of Congress, what their voting record is. We find that candidates who are more moderate tend to overperform.
One question that we got was about the incumbency factor, which you just described. Marcus asks, how much does tenure as an incumbent matter in the model? Would a long-sitting senator's chances be priced differently than someone like Warnock, who's only been in for a couple of years?
What we do is look at the incumbents' margin in their most recent election, including whether they were facing another incumbent. If they beat another incumbent, it's more impressive than winning re-election as an incumbent. So we look at how their previous race went. That's adjusted in some complicated ways if they're in a new district. We also look at congressional approval ratings. That is, how popular is Congress overall. That tends to dictate the degree of the incumbency advantage. The incumbency advantage, by the way, is much smaller than it once was. There are also characteristics of a state or district that tend to predict a stronger incumbency advantage. If you are from a small state, senators from small states, meaning low population states, maybe not geographically small, tend to get reelected more often. They're better known to their constituents. There are more constituent services. They can do pork barrel more effectively. If you're a state like Alaska or West Virginia, you can get a lot of gifts because you're an influential vote, right? And voters at home like that to some degree. So yeah, it's, of course the model accounts for incumbency, but in a pretty complicated, sophisticated, quote unquote way.
We got some broad questions about the forecast as well. And one question that I think a lot of people have asked some version of this is this question from Kyle. And it's, at what point will the model stop assuming a reversion towards Republicans in the generic ballot? For example, if we're 30 days out from the election and the generic ballot average is still at D+1, 1 point advantage for Democrats in the generic ballot, which is when you ask voters if they would vote for Democrats or Republicans for Congress in general. The question is, will the model start to assume that 2022 will be a neutral or Democratic-leaning environment at that point?
That's a really hard question. I feel like it's so difficult to try and pick out exactly, because the problem is that when we talk about midterms swinging back on whoever won the last presidential election, that's a small sample size. That there's only one of those every every 4 years, really, and as a result, you have an incredibly small sample size. I was just thinking earlier in this conversation how they were talking about, for example, how Democrats overperformed. I believe it was in the 2014 midterms they talked about after Obama beat Romney. And man, it feels like we are in a different world of a political environment when it if you compare now to 2014. I mean, certainly there's some constants, but the landscape just changes so quickly that I think a criticism that I have heard of polling before. That I think holds some water is it can be very difficult to predict new phenomena in these sort of elections that only happen every once in a while because it doesn't have a good sample size.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there. So for anybody who doesn't know Nate Silver's background, this is a guy that used to do like sports statistics. That's how he originally made a name for himself, and then he took that same skill set and tried to apply it to politics, and that's how he got to where he's at now. But basically, it's just the art of using past events to predict future events. The idea is that something's more likely to happen again if it already happened before, and yeah, like you said, it's a big problem if you have a really small sample size for something. So now that idea that midterms tend to go against the president's party, that's like one of the most consistent trends in American politics, and it's still hard to justify because like you said, it's only every 4 years, and it's hard to even know. It's like is this some is this some rule that's going to like persist through a lot of different political environments, or is it something that we've just seen repeatedly because of the type of political environments we've in, but it could change due to some kind of paradigm shift that we may or may not have already had and just don't even know. It's like yeah.
Yeah, I'm really curious what Nate's response here is going to be, because I think this is a really good criticism that you could sometimes make of polling. And one of the reasons why you should always take polling with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and why they put so much uncertainty into their model, which...
Yep.
Yeah.
1.2 percentage points. In our forecast of the popular vote, Republicans are ahead by 2.8 percentage points. So that's a 4-point gap, right? So what explains that? One factor that is not much discussed is that there are more races this year where there's no Democratic candidate than races where there's no Republican candidate. And so that causes a skew. That if everyone goes to the polls intending to vote for a Democrat or a Republican in line with the numbers in the generic ballot, sometimes you actually don't have a Democrat to vote for in your district, and so we think the GOP will do better in the popular vote than the generic ballot per se. So that's one source of difference, right? Another source is that many of these generic ballot polls are still among registered voters or even all adults. Based on historic trends as well as data so far this year, the model assumes that registered voter polls are likely to be more favorable to Democrats than likely voter polls, so that's another factor. And then, yes, the model still has an initial expectation that it was going to be a good year for Republicans. Every day that you don't see movement toward Republicans on the generic ballot, that prior gets a little bit weaker. But that won't phase out until like literally the day before the election.
you wrote a piece recently for the website called The Asterisk Election, basically saying that there are these certain circumstances in which the midterm curse doesn't hold. They're well known at this point. We've talked about them on this podcast. They're post September 11th, during the Bill Clinton impeachment trial, post the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Great Depression. So in an ideal world where there be a lever you can pull to say, hey, these are unprecedented times and this might be an asterisk election, maybe you shouldn't weight that prior as a normal midterm model would.
Yeah, all times are
I don't know.
unprecedented,
I think
though.
there will be
You
plenty
can
of
always find a
explanations if
reason to
Democrats,
say that the present day is
do have a
exceptional.
relatively good year, right? I mean, I think Dobbs and Trump's involvement were in the aftermath of a pandemic. I guess we're still in a pandemic, technically.
Wait, when do pandemics end? Sorry, I'm getting us off track, but when are we going to say that we're not in a pandemic anymore?
No.
I think when the WHO has some committee say we're not in a pandemic anymore.
Okay.
I think as it matters, or as it relates to this matter, it's when most people think we aren't anymore. And I think that most people at this point have really moved on.
Yeah, I mean,
For better or
certainly
for worse.
the median voter has very likely moved on, and I would expect the vast majority of people who do still think we're in a pandemic are probably like pretty solid Democratic voters too.
Yeah.
So yeah, I also I want to add a little bit onto a couple of the things that Nate was saying earlier. So one thing he was saying was like with every day that goes by, the numbers tick a little bit away the prior the expectation that they had, and the idea of that is basically just that there's less and less time for unexpected events to turn things around. So therefore, the evidence at hand becomes more and more conclusive. It never gets to perfect certainty, but it inches a little bit closer to it as time goes on. And then I totally forget the other thing that I was going to say. So,
all right.
By the way,
We'll follow up on that in a future model talk, but go ahead. Anyway, the ahistoric nature of 2022.
No, I mean, you don't want to assume it in advance. I mean, look, a model incorporates a great deal of information. There can always be subjective information or hard to actualize information that may exist outside the model, right? And so I might say, hey, maybe we have our forecast and maybe I lean a little more optimistic about this data or this result for this party or that party for this or that reason, right? But yeah, I mean, again, the model is trying to be pretty comprehensive and factors that don't generalize well, like subjective one-off factors. I mean, who knows? In 2020, we made to a presidential model a bunch of adjustments that were inspired in part by COVID, because it was clearly such a weird circumstance, right, where it literally affected the mechanics of voting, right? The most severe pandemic, the most deaths in a year, I think, right, in 100 years or something, right? Like, that was something where it does require you to step back and say, okay, I think we actually have to be adults here and acknowledge that, like, this is not a normal circumstance. This is more speculation. That it wouldn't be, people will have no shortage of reasons if Democrats somehow, like, keep the House or lose 5 House seats and win 2 Senate seats. There'll be no shortage of explanations for that. And so, I don't know. I don't know if it's an argument that you should be more bullish on Democrats' chances than the model, or just that, like, the bullishness the model already reflects. Because at this point, the model is kind of saying that, like, it's more likely that Democrats, like, is this right? I think we actually have Democrats favored to gain a seat in the Senate, right? What's the average forecast? In the average forecast, they wind up with 51 seats. So it's actually forecasting a 1-seat gain. So the model's already saying that, like, something unusual is likely to happen this year, right? But, and so it's kind of explaining why that number is 72% and not 25% or something.
Nate, there is some perhaps negative news for Democrats that came out this morning that I do want to get to. So let's talk about the latest inflation data. The most recent inflation data came out on Tuesday and showed prices rising 8.3% compared with a year ago. Overall inflation was down slightly from last month, but core inflation, which strips out gas and food prices, was up to 6.3% from 5.9% last month. As gas prices have fallen, I think focus has shifted away from inflation a little bit, and Biden's approval rating has risen over the past month, noticeably. So, how should we think, Nate, about this latest inflation data in the context of the election and Biden's approval?
I mean, it depends in part on whether voters are looking at the short-term trend or the long-term trend. So in the short run, last month you had a big decline in gas prices that's reducing headline inflation, right? But you had an increase in non-gas prices relative to last month. That was in fact a little bit bigger than expected. So, if voters are noticing that back to school supplies are expensive, or they're noticing that, restaurant dining is still quite expensive, or things like that, right? Maybe they travel for Labor Day. That sector of the economy tends to be very pricey right now. And inflation is up a lot over the past year. It's not up nearly as much over the past month, and so how voters weigh those things, I think, is not quite certain. Gas prices, I think, have a singular impact because they're like literally advertised on giant signs every time you go driving, and because it's an expense that that people kind of feel at the margin a lot. The fact that gas prices seem to be steady or declining is maybe bullish for Biden. But yeah, I mean, Biden would rather have had a better inflation report today. The market was off quite a lot today over concerns that the Fed will raise interest rates. It's considered cringe to talk about the stock market, but people notice that. It's another very visible indicator. So yeah, this is that news. It's incremental. It wasn't a terrible report, but worse than economists expected. That's probably the most important news of the week from an election forecasting standpoint.
It's really interesting to me that how little that made an impact compared to that particular report made compared to previous stuff we've been hearing about inflation in the economy. And Nate was actually sort of getting at it, the difference between like inflation on headline items, things like gas, versus like restaurants, and how that manifests is really interesting. A big sort of frustration that I think a lot of more left-leaning Democrats had is that the economy was doing great in a lot of areas over the summer, except for in a couple places. And it felt like Biden was getting raked over the coals, even though the economy is doing pretty well in a lot of places. It's just a couple places. And the question, I think, is the couple places where the economy wasn't doing well, which, to be fair, are some pretty big asterisks. We're talking about like gas prices, for example. That's like going to be one of the biggest expenses for most households. Is sort of what direction is it? Do we care about these gas prices just because they are the headline? They're one of the things that like the CPI is like tagged to. It's like one of the things that determines big inflation. Or is the reason why we have it tagged to gas prices because so many people care about it? And I think that's a really interesting question as we then move into an era where it's sort of now the reverse. Gas prices are really coming down, but like Nate says, you're seeing inflation just generally in other areas of the economy. Is it going to be the case that Democrats can ignore, in the same way that you might say that Republicans might have ignored the fact that prices were fine on other things but high on gas? Are Democrats going to be able to ignore that and just be like, yeah, look at all these pictures of gas stations where the number is lower than it was during the summer, and those prices have come down? Or is it going to be sort of a poison pill where if prices are rising on a good that's widely used, it doesn't matter if it's like a mainline good or if it's like just more like gas prices, or if it's something less, I guess, irrelevant, as like gas prices are. That's a very like visceral thing that you see everywhere and affects a lot of people everywhere. Is it the case that the incumbent is just always going to be massively hurt by that, irregardless of where it's occurring?
Yeah, well, with gas prices, it's not only a highly visible household expense that people are going to have on their minds a lot. It's also something that affects supply chains a lot, just because so much of our economy, revolves around like trucking and shipping and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it just ties into the price for basically everything else. Also, I remembered the thing I was going to say earlier, which is that there's this long-standing idea that low propensity voters tend to lean Democratic more than Republican, and so then the idea is that events that are really volatile in the news are typically going to have a bigger effect on Democratic turnout than on Republican turnout, and that's like relevant to the when he was talking earlier about the
Yeah.
generic ballot numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, and another sort of huge twist to all of this polling stuff is the fact that Biden doesn't poll very well. Part of the reason why Biden's polling is so low is because Biden is not getting sort of the freebie of everyone on the left supporting him, as you would typically expect. Many presidents, their polling gets inflated by the fact that if you ask most people from their party, do you like them, they're going to say yes. But because, arguably the left wing has a bit of a, shall we say, inflated problem. It's not unique. I don't really buy this whole, the left eats their own and the right is just this unified wall. But certainly we have some very vocal sort of anti-Biden elements of the left wing, particularly online. You've also got to wonder how much is that going to translate into the voting box? Is it really going to be because it absolutely could be the case that there's a big chunk of people out there who came out in 2020 because they don't like Trump, but they would have preferred, Bernie or maybe even a Warren. Biden's really not their guy. And when it comes to some of these House and Senate races, they're not going to be pouring out to support some of these more moderate Democrats. But it also could totally be the case that all these Bernie bros, they talk about how they do not like Biden, and fair enough, they have the disagreements, but they're not going to let Republicans who are in the middle of trying to pass a nationwide abortion ban, they're that they might say they don't like Biden. They might really not, but they hate Republicans even more. And they are going to make that tactical choice to vote for, an option that they don't like, but one that is far less bad from their perception than the alternative.
Yeah, a lot of the kind of predictive factors of voting are going to apply differently to that block than they would for most other voters, right? So like for example, people that are like far left or Bernie Bros or whatever are disproportionately young, right? And young people just
Yeah.
generally tend to not turn out. But then also they're going to be disproportionately motivated by the Roe v. Wade thing, like you said. But then also like they probably care less about the kind of like legislative wins that Biden got, and like who knows how they even feel about Ukraine, and who knows how they feel about gas prices and all
Yeah.
this different stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and just speaking about Ukraine, obviously, I think it was like late last night, early today, we had the announcement from Putin about mobilization, partial mobilization in Russia. That's another thing where, let's say it's, October 20th, we're like a week out from the election, and Putin announces full mobilization, and we get a torrent of media coverage about how Ukraine is getting brutalized by the Russian army, a massive invasion force. Russia hasn't exactly conducted itself the best, the most in the most moral and upright way so far. If they launch a huge offensive, maybe they generate a bunch of media about more war crimes and abuses of Ukrainians, and that's a huge boost for Democrats. It's so in flux that even now, when we're less than 2 months out, it still feels like it's difficult to say anything with certainty.
I think that the hypothetical you posed with like a last minute Russian offensive in Ukraine seems like it would be well, I mean, you framed it as a boost for Democrats, and like, sure, I mean, it kind of is, but I think it's a boost for Democrats mainly because of how damaging it would be for
Yeah.
Republicans, but like because if you're the party that's been kind of soft on Russia these last few years, and it's like, oh, suddenly they're just war criming left and right.
Yeah, it's not a good look. Although
It's
it also could go, I mean, the other way. Let's say that Russia invades and Ukraine gets crushed, I mean, I don't really think that's very likely based on the competence we've seen from the Russian armed forces so far. But let's say that's the case. I think a big part of the reason why people like supporting Ukraine is people love a winner, man. It's no surprise that I think it was like Bill Clinton that got brought in I want to say the 2008 DNC to give a 2008 DNC speech, because for a lot of people it seemed like, oh man, even though it had only been 2 terms of Bush, it was like, oh, it seems so distant since we've had like a real like democratic force to be reckoned with, with how high Bush's approval was for a healthy part of his presidency. Um, and if it was the case that, let's say Russia really starts to put the pinch on Ukraine, and Ukraine starts to falter and fumble, I have no doubt that that might hurt confidence in our ability to support Ukraine. People might say, it's sad, but this is an inevitability. What were we thinking? Thinking that Ukraine could ever stand up to Russia? This is foolish. We've all we've done is prolong the conflict and made it worse. Or it could go the exact opposite way. Maybe Russia rolls over Ukraine, and that's and Russia goes too far, and that's like an example. Like, yeah, now we really need to put the screws on them. Yeah, it can go so many different ways, even without much change to what actually happens. You could have some very slight variations in the same event, and it could have, I feel like, very easily massively different outcomes in terms of how it affects elections, particularly this upcoming election.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm trying to make sense of this, I guess, in the context of, Biden's approval rating improving over the past month. Like, those rises in core inflation, if people were experiencing them, they experienced them during the month that Biden's approval rating actually improved, right? Like, we're looking at data from a month that already happened. So are people just reacting more intensely to gas prices than they are to prices at restaurants or for new vehicles or rent? I think I'm trying to recite the sectors of core inflation that rose the most based on what I saw this morning, right? Like, these two things happened at the same time. Core inflation sped up and Biden's approval rating improved by like 5 points.
Core inflation is important to economists because energy prices are more cyclical and can dominate the index, right? To a regular voter, if anything, they probably put more weight on energy prices because it's just more visible, right? And so from a consumer, like kind of in the consumer-weighted bucket of goods, they may perceive prices as declining. Because prices did decline, the whole bucket, including energy prices, did decline month over month. And like the consumer-weighted index of it, where maybe they double weight energy prices, right? Then that might outweigh the fact that food and stuff like that is still really expensive. So yeah, from a consumer standpoint, I think it looks a little bit better than from an economic standpoint.
All right, that makes sense. So speaking of, potential bad news for Democrats, our friend Nate Cohn at The Upshot poured some cold water on Democrats' hopes in his most recent report, essentially drawing folks' attention to a trend that he sees in the 2022 polling. And I'd like to get your take on some of this. So here's what he writes. Quote, "Good for Wisconsin Democrats might be too good to be true. The state was ground zero for survey error in 2020 when pre-election polls proved to be too good to be true for Mr. Biden. In the end, the polls overestimated Mr. Biden by about 8 percentage points. Eerily enough, Mr. Barnes," he's talking about Mandela Barnes, the Senate candidate who's running against Ron Johnson there, "is faring better than expected by a similar margin," so 8 percentage points again. He goes on to say, "The Wisconsin data is just one example of a broader pattern across the battlegrounds. The more the polls overestimated Mr. Biden last time, the better Democrats seem to be doing relative to expectations. And conversely, Democrats are posting less impressive numbers in some of the states where the polls were fairly accurate 2 years ago, like Georgia." So we have talked about polling error before on this podcast. We have even talked specifically about Wisconsin and Ohio. In fact, I think the most recent model talk, we really dug into this question. But we didn't get quite this precise about it, which is that Nate Cohn sees a trend where, he's not saying that all the polling is off, but it looks like there might be a 2020 style, polling error pattern repeating itself. How much credence do you give to this sort of red flag that he's waving when it comes to, the polling industry?
I basically think people have the wrong prior on this question. I think people should have a fairly strong initial view that the direction of polling error is hard to predict. Meaning, yes, it's very possible that polls could, again, overrate Democrats. It's also possible they could overrate Republicans. So I'm kind of treat the abstract version of this first, right? So why was this a good belief to have? There are a few reasons. Number one, historically, if you look at polls, the error bounces back from year to year, so it's not very predictable in that sense. Number two, if you look at kind of like pundit conventional wisdom about which direction the polling error will be, that does not tend to be very accurate. It was accurate, I guess, in 2020, but there are lots of years in 2014. There were big debates about how polls would underrate Democrats in the midterms. They wound up overrating Democrats instead, right? This type of thing happens a lot. So people's guesswork has not been very good. Number three, pollsters have pretty big incentives to be accurate. So yes, if you notice that the kind of thermostat, or thermometer, I guess, in your room says the temperature is 70 when the temperature is really 75, you probably don't leave that unchanged, right? You probably get a new thermometer or adjust the thermometer to work properly, and then you might not have the same problem going forward. You can also overcompensate. You tinker with three things to make sure Republicans have better numbers. It turns out that you only need to do one of those things. The other two kind of created bias in the other direction, right? So that's another argument. Number four, kind of the market for polling is sort of a market in the sense that polling is not cheap. Which people do polling depends on which ones are successful or not. We also have polls to ratings that look at their past success, and so you now have a larger number of conservative-leaning pollsters who now have a higher weight in the 538 model based on the fact that they generally had good years in 2020. So, there are already like a lot of checks and balances in the model, and I don't know. I think people are a little bit superstitious about, an event that I think if you're really trying to step back and be rigorous about this, then I don't know that that's a safe assumption, right? People go, the presumption is that the polls are going to be biased, and maybe they won't be. I think the kind of the wrong part of it is foregrounded and backgrounded, right? The presumption should be that polling can be biased, but the bias is unpredictable. But maybe here are some reasons to worry that there'll be, a bias toward Democrats this year.
We have talked a good amount on this podcast about how pollsters do have incentives to change their methods if they're repeatedly getting errors in the same direction. But Cohn, in his most recent article, writes, most pollsters haven't made significant methodological changes since the last election. The major polling community post-mortem declared that it was, quote, impossible to definitively ascertain what went wrong in the 2020 election. He does then go on to say that some pollsters are making efforts to deal with the challenge. One pollster in particular, he points out, says that they're restricting the number of Democratic primary voters, early voters, and other super engaged Democrats in their surveys, which Cohn also says the New York Times and Siena College polls are doing. So let's talk about both of those things. One, do you find it concerning that most pollsters aren't making methodological changes? And amongst those that are, so the Times, Siena College, and perhaps other pollsters that might be limiting Democratic primary voters in their sample, is that the way to go about things?
I don't necessarily accept the premise that most pollsters aren't making changes. I would want to see, look, there are reasons to think that maybe that 2020 was a quirk. The best reason is that because of COVID, this is at a point in the pandemic where pre-vaccine, or essentially pre-vaccine, I guess it was pre-vaccine, Pfizer's announcement came out afterward. People were still locking down and being very careful, and Democrats were much more careful than Republicans, therefore they were much more likely to be at home answering phone calls. Like, that to me seems like a pretty valid reason why you might have had a polling error in 2020 that might not apply. Also, in elections without Trump on the ballot, there hasn't been a Republican-leaning polling error, right? In 2018, there was no systematic error. There was in some races, right? In
And
these
but
various,
I do want to say, because like those polling errors that we did see in 2018 happened in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania, to some extent in Michigan, it happened in Florida. Some of these key states that were looking at competitive races in this cycle. And so, given that, I mean, you would start to see like maybe there was an underestimation of Republicans' performance in 2016, 2018, and 2020.
yeah, I don't necessarily inherently know why that would be the case. I mean, it's worth pointing out, I think. I mean, look, I should preface this by all saying that, like, by saying our model actually does assume that Democrats will not perform as well as the polls currently show, right? That's based on, in some of these races, the quote unquote fundamentals being worse for Democrats than the polls show. It's based on the fact that it's September, it's not November, you still have almost 2 months to go, and there's some reason to suspect there'll be some reversion of the historical mean. You still have some polls that are among registered voters. We think when everything converts to likely voters, that might hurt Democrats by a point or so, although clearly you don't have the sort of major enthusiasm gap that you've had in some past election cycles. So, is it
That
true
was the
that,
thing
like,
about low propensity
our
voters that I was
our
bringing
model,
up.
like, doesn't
Yep.
buy that the polls are giving the best snapshot of the Wisconsin race, right? But I don't think the right assumption is that, like, polls have a systematic Democratic bias.
Yeah, I think that's basically he's being a little meandering, but I think that's basically the nail on the head. There is just this attitude that is, oh, well, the polls are biased for Democrats, and it's mostly just a cope, I think, from right-leaning people that do not want to have to deal with the fact that sometimes that, much like a certain brand of of more left-leaning Democrats, don't want to deal with the fact that their ideas aren't nearly as popular as they'd like them to be. I think there's also, this kind of attitude in the Republican Party as well. Everyone likes to think that their ideas are the right ideas, that everyone secretly agrees with, right? That the silent majority actually stands with us. And I think it's an area you see on both sides. And people just sort of very much just gloss over the very rigorous, means by which you come to the conclusions based off of polling and just say, oh, well, people said Trump wouldn't win, and then he did win. What a biased poll. The polling there just did not do its job. And it's just like, to begin to prove that the polling actually overestimated, you need to do so much work. And they never actually do that. And then I think when you do dig into these analyses, you see that it is a much more complex story. I mean, there really wasn't much of a polling error in 2016. There absolutely was in 2020, like they're talking about here. But I think that most people would actually point to 2016 as being a bigger polling error because Trump won, and then he didn't win in 2020. But I think that the fact that you see the bigger polling error in favor of Democrats in 2020 when Democrats won sort of belies the fact that you have to have a more nuanced analysis than you said A wouldn't happen, wasn't likely to happen, and then A happened. If Democrats are, like you said at the start of this, if you're favored to only 30% chance to win and you win, that's totally normal. That's very likely. Even though the other person's sitting there thinking, how could I lose with 70% chance?
Yeah. So I think people are pretty bad at dealing with uncertainty, and that's why I think they like have this kind of. Well, that's one of the reasons why they have this kind of cope in the first place. Another reason is because they just don't want to accept the answer that they're being told. But yeah, I mean, people like to have certain predictions that X or Y is gonna
Yeah.
happen, rather than probabilistic predictions.
It's so boring to say, like, well, we don't really know, who's to say the future is uncertain, compared to like, blue wave coming, Republicux will be crushed by new AOC wing of the like Democratic Party. Like, this kind of stuff is just not fun to believe, so people don't believe it.
Yeah. So as far as people saying a bunch of stuff critical about polling in general, saying that they like don't buy into it because it's biased or whatever. The thing that's maddening about that to me is that those same people are nearly always employing biased methods of prediction of their own, which
Yeah.
are significantly worse than polling. It's just like they've got all the same biases but without any of the evidence.
Yeah. There's I don't know if you follow League of Legends at all, but there's this content creator called LS, who is very much known for wanting to do more of like a sort of data systems approach as to like analyzing. He very much wants to boil the competitive side of League of Legends down to a science. And he all the time, and as a result, you could imagine he's run through all these arguments of like, oh, but they chose this champion and they won. It's like, yes, but that was unlikely. If the enemy had played better, they would have countered it, which means the correct pick is actually this. Like, and he talks about how like competitive play is stuck in a rut, and it's funny. He has a phrase that he just uses, and he just says results based Andy, which I just love because it's such a great way to cut to the core of like the logical like mistakes in terms of trying to come to like actual actionable like statistical information that people make, where they just say, oh, Trump won in 2016, oh, polls must have been off, results based Andy, instead of actually digging in. But no one ever does.
Yeah, and it's like if you try to talk to people about like why do they even care that the polls are off, or how do they know that the polls are off, or any of this kind of stuff, like you just end up with these like insane webs of like contradictory justifications. But yeah, like the idea of just being results based is highly imperfect, but it's the best we can do.
Haven't over the long run, they haven't in elections. I mean, they did in 2016, 2020, and 2014 for that matter, right? 2012, you had a Republican bias in the polls. So far in these special elections since Dobbs, you've had a Republican bias, if anything, right? So yeah, I just think I'm just holding on to that prior as a good macro rule.
What would have to happen for you to give up that prior?
If I were just convinced that the polls were systematically biased and that couldn't be fixed, then I probably wouldn't run a polling website anymore.
Oh, interesting.
Bro, that is such a bad answer. What would it take you to convince you that there is? Well, if I was convinced, then, like, at first I thought, well, if I was convinced, well, dude, that's the question. What would convince you? But then he doesn't even actually say it. He's just saying, well, if I ever did become convinced that I would probably retire after. It's like, yeah, that's true, but, like, why? Like you. That's just such a bad answer.
It could be that he's about to answer. We don't know yet.
Yeah, babe, sorry, hold on. Maybe we're clinching in here.
But, like, what
Yeah.
would have to happen in the real world? Like, what
Okay,
would
here we
be an indicator to you that there was a systematic bias? How many election cycles would we have to get through?
At least two more.
At least two more. Okay. So you're sticking around for at least two more, Nate.
Oh. The thing about elections, man, is like
That face that you
You only
just
have
made
one
when I
every-
say that was priceless.
you only have one election every 2 years. You know what I mean? Or every 4 years if you don't care about midterms. And so, like, people dwell on the fact that, like, oh my God, this happened twice in a row. Or actually, if you do look at the midterm, 2 of the last 3 times, right? Something happening 2 times out of 3 is not a particularly robust trend, right? It's just that elections are very consequential, and
Yeah.
people like to cast blame. People like to moralize about elections, right?
Nate, it's all your fault, actually.
And people like to believe the world is more
fair.
predictable than it is also.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, when he says the 2 elections, I mean, I he's making good arguments, but I think it's also equally damning for other arguments because, national electoral politics can shift very quickly. You have a small window to run for president in America. Just go ask Chris Christie about that. And there is just and if you require, like, if it is a requirement for you to see 2-3 election cycles in a row before you understand this phenomenon exists, on the one hand, Nate Silver's saying, hey, 2 out of 3, that's not reliable. That's true. But equally, phenomena move pretty quick, man, and you could just be totally blinded by something that pops up and immediately starts taking effect. You could be totally blinded to that for a couple of election cycles, right? Let's say, for example, there is a real bias going on for Democrats in polling. Nate Silver is not going to be able to catch that until it has already taken effect for 2-3 election cycles. And what if there's a phenomenon that only lasts 2-3 election cycles, right? Like, arguably, 9/11 and the effect that had, that was a big effect that had on our elections, but that didn't last even 3 election cycles. And so a phenomenon that lasted as long as that could theoretically be totally undetectable to this. And it's tough because I really can see both sides of this argument. On the one hand, oh, it happened 2 times, therefore it's a trend. Like, shut the fuck up, dude. Like, this is so, like, damn, dude, my dad won the lottery. Let's go buy tickets. But on the other hand, it's like, man, you could. I'm very sympathetic. Like, you're always asking yourself, what would it take to prove me wrong, or what if I was wrong about this? And man, if we were wrong about this, we could totally be blind to these kinds of trends.
Yeah, and in fairness to him, he did say at least 2 more. He didn't say
Yeah.
exactly 2 more. But
Yeah.
you know what? You said something early on a minute ago, where you were saying like you only have a narrow window of time to run because and you cited Chris Christie. But I'd like to point out Joe Biden ran for president 3 times, starting in 1988.
Yeah, that's yeah. I mean, I guess there's an exception for every rule. I guess I would say you have only a small chance to win. I don't really. It doesn't really seem like. I guess to be fair, I'm not as familiar with with some of those elections, but I don't think that Joe Biden was ever a real front runner in those.
No, he wasn't. I mean, likewise, Trump ran for president, and then the Reform Party in 2000 didn't get any significant amount of. I mean, he got a third party nomination. But yeah, I mean, lots of people who become president have run before. The same thing was true for George H.W. Bush and so on. But yeah.
We actually got a question along those lines. Well, not really along those lines. It's a question that we have answered before, but we'll answer it again. Eve asks, does the model factor in bias introduced by voters or poll responders reacting to the 538 model? I gotta say, Eve, I think she might give the 538 model a little too much credit. But this idea that we ourselves, the 538 website, the forecast, this podcast maybe, are shaping voter behavior.
The standard answer here is that, like, in a two-way race, you have a Democrat and Republican running, that there's not much evidence that media coverage systematically affects things. In a multi-way race, like a primary, you want to get media coverage, right? Just the kind of volume and tone of media coverage can matter because voters are strategic. If voters see a poll showing Elizabeth Warren falling behind Bernie Sanders, they may say, well, I like Warren more than Sanders, but I like Sanders more than Biden, so I'll switch now to Bernie. That accelerates her decline in the polls, becomes sort of self-fulfilling. So those dynamics of media coverage and horse race coverage are very important in the multi-way tactical strategic voting context. I think they're less important in a two-way race. And it's not clear directionally which way they would go, right? Because we get accused of, oh, you're trying to suppress turnout by having this candidate do well, right? Or the reverse, oh, you're trying to lower morale by having, like, it's not very clear kind of in which direction this goes. To be frank, there have been some academic papers on this, some of which are okay and don't have much of an effect, some of which are dubious, because a lot of papers are dubious, let's be honest. So, yeah, but I think the short answer is I don't think it affects things much, but, I mean, this year was weird in that, like, the 538 model kind of came out right at a time when there was a shift in conventional wisdom, because all these things started happening for Democrats, right? Inflation started to abate to some degree. The Dobbs decision was handed down, like, kind of right when the model was coming out, basically. And then you have these various legislative successes from Biden that were not necessarily preordained. COVID situation's been relatively tame, so they've kind of had like a best course scenario, and like I don't think that or best case scenario. This does not seem to me like one of these times when there's like spurious shifts in the narrative for no reason, right? Big news events have happened. They all more or less happen to favor Democrats. The polls have shifted as a result. This seems to be like a pretty robust kind of conclusion and not the conventional wisdom run amok.
Zach asks a question related to what you were just saying about how if you did want to shape voter behavior with a polling result, how would you do it in the first place? Zach asks, should polls released by campaigns be interpreted differently based on who's ahead? For example, people behind might want to emphasize that they're real contenders, while people ahead might want to claim the race is quite tight to motivate voters to show up. So do we always assume that internal polls are inflating that candidate's chances, or do they sometimes deflate that candidate's chances?
I mean, I can think of some instances, right? Sometimes a campaign will release an internal poll if it's worried about voter complacency. I think the Obama campaign did that once in Pennsylvania, right? Um, you know, sometimes if campaigns are competing for national fundraising dollars, maybe a candidate who is assumed to be way ahead will release a poll or leak a rumor of a poll that may or may not actually exist to try to like create a perception that that race needs more money if they're behind in fundraising. So I can think of like times when it's happened, but it's unusual. I mean, are there some patterns? Probably when you're further behind, you probably need to catch up more, right? If you're 8 points ahead, you don't have to exaggerate that margin necessarily, right? But we just use a one size fits all adjustment for partisan polls and don't try to get too cute.
All right,
Can we pause here?
Yeah.
So he was talking about like how might what are the incentives for a campaign to kind of like play up or play down their chances. But I think one thing that I'm a little surprised he didn't mention is how that works when one of the parties or one of the candidates is kind of at odds with the electoral system itself. So like Trump going into the 2020 election was kind of showing some indications that he was unlikely to accept the outcome if he lost, right? Um, so I think that creates like a different set of incentives for him to kind of like give credibility to some polls and not other,
Yeah.
like for example, like I don't know if he actually did this, but hypothetically his campaign could have released a bunch of internal polls saying like look, we're doing really well, all those mainstream media polls are fake, and it's a conspiracy to try to steal the election from me.
Yeah. The the thing about all this polling stuff, and we've mentioned it a couple times, is that simply reporting an observation can affect the reality that that observation is trying to give you information about. So if you say, "Oh, it's looking like Biden's gonna do a steamroll," by saying that, you might make it so Biden's actually less likely to do a steamroll now. Which introduces this a huge, and of course, then people also want to, and as a result, people will then want to fight over it, right? If you say, "Oh, Democrats are doomed; they have no chance," there'll be some Democrats that are like, "No, that's bullshit. Fuck you. That's not true," and they'll make those arguments as to why, and it just gets so messy. I I really do think that you just have to take all these you know polling and predictions like this, especially now of all times with how unpredictable our politics has become, you have to take it with not just a grain, but like a hefty portion of salt, because it is just so impossible to detangle all of this. Like I don't have a good response. I've talked about this a couple times now, and my thing is like I guess you just throw up your arms and sort of downgrade the certainty you have in any of these positions by like a healthy margin. But even that is like a very difficult thing to do to sort out in your head. Like, oh, I'm actually going to think that this is now 20% less likely. Like, that's not like an easy. That like you can't do that. You can like have some downgrade, but the human mind doesn't work in like percentage numbers like that.
Yeah. So the thing about the polls themselves affecting voter behavior reminds me of a similar thing that happens with standardized tests, where if a standardized test becomes very widely adopted, then essentially what will happen is people will start studying specifically for that test, or like preparing specifically for it, and then the test becomes less efficacious at measuring whatever it is that it was
Yeah.
trying to measure.
Yep.
And so I wonder if like these you know not that people are like studying to take a poll, right? But to the extent that the polls are affecting voter behavior, I wonder like how well does that analogy hold up?
I think it's less that like the test is being specifically taught to, and more like the knowledge base is evolving. I think maybe a slightly better analogy would be how just over time, educational standards will increase because as you're trying to test and select for almost not even necessarily an absolute intelligence, but a relative intelligence, you have to upgrade them. I'm reminded actually of there are certain certification tests in the IT world that will literally have a certain percentage pass rate. So it's not the case that everyone can show up and pass. They will specifically sometimes change the ways. I don't understand the mechanics exactly, but so I might be getting some of the details wrong here. But it is absolutely the case that two people could get the same score on different years, and one of them could pass and one of them could fail because they are adjusting it so that only like this maybe like the top 20% pass. And then that's like a real thing that could happen. Or not it can happen. That it's done by design with some of these tests.
This reminds me also of I had a statistics class one time, and this teacher explained to the class why it's actually like statistically ideal to try to design tests such that the average score in the class is around 50%.
That's
And
it, dude. That's I can just imagine being in that lecture hall. Like, there's some fucking, but like you hear that day one, you're like, oh, it's gonna be one of these classes. Okay, here we go.
and it was there was a test in that class where I think the average score was like 15% or something.
Oh,
So he missed the mark a little bit. Like I buy into his argument though about like why it needs to be around 50%, but it's like a statistics argument that I'm not gonna like
yeah.
you
Well,
know
the colleges don't want to always say this, but I mean, there are explicitly, it's depending upon where you're at, like weed out classes that are designed where it's like, okay, if you really want to go into computer science, you need to prove it by getting past this class, and it'll be just like a brutal class that like will weed people out.
Yeah, this was definitely one of those. I mean, so my education's in physics, and like I think in physics, so most people think of like the electromagnetism classes as like the ones that weed people out. This one was statistical mechanics, so it was about like the statistical relationship between like quantum mechanics and thermodynamics and stuff, and it was just like super hard to even like conceptually understand what is all this math that we're even doing on top of the fact that the math is hard. It's like, so yeah, it's just people getting 15% on tests and stuff, and I think the end result of all this was when I started that physics program, I think it probably had somewhere around 300 people in it, and I think maybe like 20 people graduated 2 years later.
Yeah, a few of the brave and the bold. Um, yeah, guys, if you're signing up for classes, do not just go do it on the online portal, in the last 2 days. Go get some intel, okay? Because the same class with two different teachers can be very different experiences, and you definitely don't want to end up in a scenario where you've actually wandered into like those, 1 out of 10 hard classes, and you've got like three of them, because that can really destroy you. So yeah, do your research, people.
And also get your textbooks early and don't buy them at the college bookstore. Get like
Yeah, you
mail
should probably
order
just
them.
Yeah, you should probably just obtain those in a way where you don't have to spend money, to be honest, if it's possible.
Well, that too. But also like even if you're just actually gonna buy them, you can typically just like order a textbook on Amazon, for 1/3 of the price that your
Oh yeah,
college
it's
bookstore is
unbelievable
gonna.
the markup. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
something else.
The rapid fire portion of this model talk. This question harkens back to the conversation we were just having, and it comes from a Twitter user named Special Puppy. Which race do the model's expectations and your personal expectations diverge the most?
Let me look at our actual up-to-the-minute forecast. I mean, some of the ones Nate mentioned, other Nate, like I personally would. Wisconsin, I don't think I buy that's 50-50. Maybe it's 60-40 Johnson, right? I probably see Nevada, which is a state where polls have done pretty well, but nonetheless, I think that's probably more of a toss-up than 60-40% Democrat.
And we're also looking at the
On the other
deluxe.
hand,
I think if we looked at the light, you might have more second guessing.
I would, for sure, yeah. Because the deluxe is a kind of building in some conventional wisdom in the form of these forecasts, right? In Georgia, I actually think I'd have Warnock as a heavier favorite than 53%. Walker certainly seems to have a lot of flaws as a candidate. I'm not sure I buy that Democrats are at 37% in North Carolina. I take the under on that. So that's like many of the races now. I guess I have somewhat different opinions, right, than the forecast.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the interesting things that's happening in Georgia is that the governor, Brian Kemp, is pretty heavily favored to win re-election. But if you were going to say that you have even more confidence in Raphael Warnock than our forecast shows, you would be talking about a situation where there's an even bigger ticket split going on, potentially. Which...
That's fair, yeah.
People have pointed to that and said, like, I'm not really sure that will be the case. Ticket splitting has declined significantly, et cetera, et cetera. But I think actually maybe Texas 2018 is a good example where you saw Greg Abbott was not in a competitive race. I think he won by the governor's race in Texas by like 14 points or something, whereas Ted Cruz won by, 2.5 points against Beto O'Rourke. And Texas isn't a particularly elastic state, so it's something that you could imagine happening.
Yeah, again, these are subtle shifts, but yeah, I'd have Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Nevada. I'm personally a little bit more bullish on Republicans than the model shows. In Georgia, I'm a little bit more bullish on Warnock. So record that, probably not guaranteed at all to be any more accurate than our model, but for posterity's sake, those are the ones that look a little bit different to my eye. I
remember the days when you refused to second guess your forecast. Thank you for playing along with the listeners, Nate. Okay. Next question. Why is there not a forecast of all of the governor's races combined, i.e., which party is forecasted to control the governor's mansion for the majority of the country's population?
There is that, I think, actually. It's just not in the
womp womp.
Cute 5e graphical part of the forecast. I think if you go down to scroll to the very bottom, where it says download the data, it says polls and model outputs. I believe that model outputs, like the top line output file, gives you information on what the likelihood is that each party controls a majority of governorships, and what I think is a better metric, actually, is which party will have governorships controlling a majority of the population, right? It's not like the Senate where, like, there's a Senate of governors, right? Mm-hmm. It's like each state matters more. The governor of California probably has a lot more influence on a larger share of the population than the governor of Wyoming. And so, so that's a metric that we actually calculate, but you have to go down to the very bottom of the interactive and download the actual data.
Awesome. News you can use, Nate. Next question. What is the probability that the balance of power in the Senate will once again be decided by a Georgia runoff?
Let me look at this, right? I mean, how often does it come down to one seat is the first question, right? So 25% of the time, it comes down to one seat. Of that 25% of the time, how much is Georgia? My guess is not more than 20% of that 25%. And then how likely does Georgia go to a runoff? We probably do calculate that somewhere. Let me see if it looks like Georgia's in a runoff about 25% of the time. I think it's actually like less likely than people think, right? Because you need that three-way parlay, right? That it comes down to one seat, that Georgia is decisive, and that Georgia goes to a runoff, right? I mean, it might be in the realm of, I'm trying to think if I'm thinking about this correctly on the fly, but it's probably in the realm of 10% or something like that, right? Or maybe a little lower. Not like, oh, this is inevitably going to happen again, right? There'll be a lot of elections where you have a Georgia runoff. That happens, again, I'm trying to look at the Sims here, again, 25% of the time or something. But some of those will be, Democrats blew it, so the best they can do is 49 seats, or, the GOP's fucked. They're at best going to have 49 of their own, so it's just a matter of the Democrats' size their majority, right? So not, it's a material possibility, but not as high as people might assume.
Another rapid fire question. This listener asks, would you ever consider creating a knob that would allow you to simulate polling error and how it would affect the forecast? You can kind of do this with the make your own path thing, but go ahead, Nate.
Yeah, you can kind of do it with the make your own path thing. I mean, I think it's a thought. It's not a bad thought. What's a little tricky is like, it's unclear like where the uncertainty comes from then, because if you assume you know in which direction the polls are going to be wrong, right? Then
why
there's kind
even
of nothing
create
to
a
predict,
forecast?
right? You just made your own predictions. So there's like no uncertainty really. I mean, I think what the New York Times did with like what happens if the polling errors are as significant as they were in 2020. I think that's that's what they're in Nate's newsletter. If you did that, right? Like that seems like a useful mental experiment. I probably do it in both directions, right? What if there's a 2012, I guess, style error where Democrats overperform their polls? I mean, it does seem like if you look at like the polls only version, Democrats have enough of a lead in some of these states that kind of like Biden in 2020, they could probably withstand a polling error, I think, right? I mean, like look at all the Democrats where, I don't have the actual forecast, but like, so in Nevada, Wisconsin, Arizona, right? In all these states, the light, meaning polls only model has Democrats with a 70% chance or higher, right? So if you assume there's a polling error, I guess they lose Georgia, but then they win somehow Wisconsin and they win Pennsylvania, right? So even if polls are off by like 3 points, I think they actually like still keep it 50-50 or even gain a seat, right? So in that sense, their lead is more robust in the Senate than you might think.
We got, I don't know if this is a serious question. I don't think it's a serious question. Ask it anyway. Would you say that Provincetown is real America? I am guessing that this is a reference to Max Boot's opinion piece, in which he argued that Provincetown and I think Martha's Vineyard are in fact real America, or just as much real America as the Rust Belt diners where reporters go to do election reporting. Give me as serious of an answer as you can on this one, Nate.
Provincetown is probably the most unusual town of 5,000 or more people in the entire United States, right? It's extremely gay, it's extremely wealthy, it's extremely liberal, it's extremely white, it's extremely middle-aged, right? Yeah, I mean, it's even unusual for like a gay population, how like ethnically homogenous it is in some ways. So this is like the worst example you could have picked. I mean, Provincetown's lovely, don't get me wrong, right? But like,
you know what? I can name a place that's even less real America.
Where?
Right? Where I am right now.
That's true. That's true.
I think Fire Island. I am currently on Fire Island. Listeners have gotten mad at me about my use of prepositions here. I'm currently in the Pines. I think it's probably even less real than Provincetown.
No, I mean, can you even drive there? Are there cars?
You cannot drive. There are no cars. There aren't even bicycles because there are only boardwalks and sand, and the boardwalks are about 3 feet wide. So you can only walk. There isn't even a grocery store that's open year-round. The grocery store closes in October.
Okay, that is more unusual for sure. I agree.
So if you had to pick a place to represent quote-unquote real America, where would you pick?
I think Nathaniel Rakich did this one since said New Haven, Connecticut, but first of all, Yale is extremely weird, right? And New England is weird, so I'm not sure I can accept that. I mean, Kansas City is probably a pretty good approximation, though maybe there aren't enough Hispanic voters there.
What about, I mean, you said Las Vegas once, which it's not Las Vegas just because of the level of tourism, but I think Nevada in general, the level of like suburban sprawl and the, ethnic and racial diversity, like we talk about this, American elections are decided in basically the suburbs, exurbs, whatever. Like that's where so many Americans live. And like, yes, America is whatever the census says, like 75% urbanized, but mostly what they're talking about in those circumstances are places that people would recognize as suburbs.
Yeah, I mean, Las Vegas off the Strip is not a bad version of the quote unquote real America. I mean, a lot of these growing cities. Houston's a fascinating city that's very ethnically diverse, right? Atlanta, I guess demographics it's more black than the country as a whole, though Atlanta has like lots of every kind of person pretty much.
What about New Jersey? I feel like New Jersey is pretty
there,
American, and
I want to say Colorado.
If you look at just the racial demographics of New Jersey,
Maybe, yeah, that's a good one.
It's I think a very close match for the U.S.
I do think Vegas outside of the Strip is another
it's
really
very
good
wealthy
answer,
and
though.
suburban, right? It's unusual for
Yeah, I think so too.
state to be. I mean, there's some like rural parts of New Jersey in the South and West New Jersey, but like it's unusual to have so few major cities but still high population density. By the way, New England is also weird for that reason too, right? You still have a lot of small towns in New England that are close to one another. That is not at all true for for most of the rest of the U.S.
Okay, so to answer this listener's question, Provincetown is not real America, but that doesn't mean that we should necessarily spend all of the time we do at Rust Belt diners. There are lots of other places to go. In fact, Nate and I will be making a reporting trip to Las Vegas for exactly this reason.
Of course.
We'll compare calendars once we get off the podcast. Nate, that's it. Any words of wisdom as we depart? We're going to be doing more of these model talks in the run-up to the election. I just have to nail your schedule down. And hopefully we'll be back in studio soon. I always like being in studio.
My advice is don't waste your time debating about individual polls or pollsters. That's amateur hour, folks. That's amateur hour. Develop a process for how you systematically deal with different types of pollsters or data points. Don't just on a one-off basis do like special pleading. Oh, I don't trust this poll. I don't like this poll. Like, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that.
Can we pause?
Great last word.
Because I feel like he's asking for something that the vast majority of people are not going to be willing to commit to. That seems like only very few like of the most media savvy people would take his advice. But on the other hand, that might be the same demographic that's listening to 538. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think that is the way to do it. But if the way to do it was the way that everyone already did it, then we wouldn't need to have this conversation in the first place.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think they're basically done here. There's like 30 more seconds of before the video ends, and 15 of that's going to be like a outro screen. So
yeah, I believe so. All right. You have any last thoughts on this before we're done?
yeah, I basically think that this is pretty close to my opinion on polling. It is not pretty or sexy to say, well, the polls seem to indicate this, but I mean, even a 30% to 70%, 30% is still pretty likely. It's not sexy at all to do that, but it's the truth. The reality is that polls are pretty boring, and you should look at them, take a honest, hard look at the 20-sided die, and figure out how unlikely you are to roll the sides on it, whatever side's least likely, and then add in a healthy bunch of skepticism, because the reality is we are still pretty far out from this election, and a lot can happen in 2 months.
Yeah, and I would like to add that the process that you're describing of just like, adding a little bit of skepticism to your beliefs is something that I would like people to adopt more broadly with respect to...
Oh yeah, by all means, don't just do that in polling. That would be a healthy dose of skepticism in all your beliefs is a good idea.
But polling is one of the most easily visible examples because it's easy to test whether your predictions are right or wrong, But
Yeah.
But there are many other instances in life where it seems like people just go around holding beliefs that with extremely high confidence that are just impervious to evidence that could easily be wrong, but they just never get swatted down with the kind of in the way that a belief about polling
Yep.
would, and yet even in polling people seem to do that, but it's a little more susceptible to being proven wrong than a lot of these other areas that where people have unwarranted beliefs.
Yep.
Okay. Do you want to shout yourself out?
Yeah, I think we're getting just about done here. My name is Flowtrace. Check me out at twitch.tv/Flowtrace, twitter.com/Flowtrace_. And you can catch me here on Wednesdays and on a host of other Twitch politics panels in and around the space.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's good to have you as always, and see you around.
See ya.